The engine's roar swallowed the last prayers. The makeshift camera shook from atop the ruins of Cologne as the hulking shape advanced down the shattered avenue. Hatches battened, antenna vibrating, its 90-millimeter barrel cutting the air like a clock hand marking a final hour. The initial impact wasn't from the shell, but from the symbol itself. Across the way, German soldiers, hollowed out by months of siege and bombardment, saw what they couldn't yet name: a new, massive tank, seemingly advancing with the inevitability of a tide. A deep, unfamiliar sound filled their guts before their minds. An engine frequency that didn't recall the familiar Shermans, but something far more potent. In seconds, their psyches searched old maps. Panther, Tiger, Sturmgeschütz. None fit. And when the Pershing locked its hull, the silence between one breath and the next marked an internal shift. This wasn't just another duel. It was the chilling realization that the very narrative of the war, until then written with an almost mystical confidence in German steel, was being edited live. Jung wrote that the living symbol is the best possible expression of something unknown, and there, the unknown weighed 40 tons. It's common to reduce the encounter to a game of numbers: armor, penetration, speed. But the moment the Pershing appeared, the technical sum was swallowed by an invisible coefficient, the coefficient of numinosity. In Man and His Symbols, Jung reminds us that an image charged with emotional energy bypasses reason and dominates the field of consciousness. What the soldier saw wasn't just a new silhouette, it was a premonition. In 1945, with the Wehrmacht in retreat and cities disfigured, the appearance of a new enemy condensed everything the psyche refused to admit: the end. That's why the mental impact was disproportionate to the statistics. Only a few dozen of these tanks crossed the Rhine, but one appearing at the right moment, filmed, commented on, pointed out, was enough to imprint the message: the after had arrived. The Cologne scene, revisited so often, is exemplary not for the number of tanks involved, but for what it dramatizes. The Pershing advances, a German Panther waits. In seconds, the 90-millimeter shot, an almost 24-pound projectile expelled at roughly 2,800 feet per second, ripped through the scene like a death sentence. For the German observer, time compressed. First, the metallic crack. Then, the explosion that turned the corner into a flash and dust. The body reacted before analysis. In cities, sound multiplied. Walls returned a chorus of echoes that shattered any illusion of control. The archetypal symbol of the dragon, the monster guarding the passage, couldn't have found a more fitting stage. Fallen bridges, scarred facades, civilians fleeing through corridors of rubble. In Psychology and Alchemy, the Negredo stage is described as putrefaction, initial darkness, a collapse of forms. Upon seeing this armed novelty advance through the ruins, many soldiers felt this psychic night descend. The hero, nurtured by years of propaganda, blurred. The military persona, built on the certainty of technical superiority, suffered its first unignorable fissure. But why would one tank, and not another, trigger such a profound response? The entire war was a collection of novelties. Here, the quality of its presence mattered. The Pershing concentrated signals. Its late arrival appearing at the beginning of the end, the barrel's thickness betraying its caliber, the quiet confidence conveyed by its hull and turret posture, and the narrative that coalesced around it, from the rumor of a bigger Sherman arriving to the filmed proof of its urban duel. For men subjected to attrition, hunger, loss of comrades, and progressive operational impotence, the starved brain fills gaps with myths. All it takes is a convincing imagistic vector. From a few appearances, the psyche constructed a colossus. It mattered little that Germany still had Panthers and Tigers capable of facing it. It mattered little that logistics and fuel were scarcer than armor. The symbol is swift. It doesn't negotiate with nuances when the soul demands shortcuts. Technically, the 90mm M3 offered Americans what had been lacking in the early years of the conflict on the Western Front: the ability to penetrate, with margin, the sloped fronts of Panthers at safer distances. For the German on the ground, however, the difference wasn't a graph, but the visceral sensation that their shelter had lost its validity. The hull that once held up now was a maybe. That maybe was a breach through which the shadow passed. Jung insisted, when the ego feels threatened, it projects its own shadow onto the other. The Pershing then became the repository of repressed fears, punishment for excesses, guilt for what was done and what couldn't be prevented, terror of dying far from home. Silent doubt about the point of going on. The enemy tank carried all of this. It advanced heavily because it advanced laden with alien psychic content. That's why, in late letters and accounts, there was less anger and more weariness, less hatred and more bitter resignation. The shadow, when unrecognized, weakens the legs. Individuation, even in war, demands a paradoxical gesture, recognizing weakness without succumbing to it. Some, upon seeing the Pershing for the first time, experienced what clinicians would call blunting. Sounds, saturated to their limit, seemed to recede. Focus narrowed. The world became a corridor with two exits: fight mechanically or preserve a remnant of oneself. It's not about judging who stayed and who retreated, but about recording what the symbol activated, an intimate choice. Rigid discipline, without the mediation of meaning, yielded to dangerous automatisms. Desperation, unchecked, became collapse. Between them, there was a thread: the human recognition that war is larger than the uniform allows one to admit. Symbols, when recognized, illuminate a path, Jung wrote. The Pershing, while threatening, also offered some that minimal clarity, the possibility of surviving the myth. Experts often remind us that few Pershings were initially sent into combat, part of a specific mission to test and introduce the new platform. This, far from weakening the psychological interpretation, confirms it. The symbolic effect doesn't require mass, but punctuality. The footage of a duel, a photograph of a newly arrived hull, the rumor of a cannon that doesn't ricochet, these elements functioned as shared dreams, daydreams that permeated companies and battalions. The soldier who never saw a Pershing swore he heard it. The one who heard it swore he saw it. In the psychic economy of war's end, the mind, starved for meaning, quickly pieced together narratives. The enemy became a metaphor, and every encounter with a living metaphor transforms the subject. What was merely fear also became language. It looks like a blind god, one observer noted. Another spoke of a will of steel. Neither described engineering, both narrated soul. There's also the irony history loves to construct. For years, the Germanic imagination benefited from the myth of the invincible Panzer. Propaganda films exploited the theatricality of the tiger, the lethal elegance of the panther. Men were taught to see in the lines of their own tanks a metaphysical confirmation: destiny had the shape of armor. When, in the end, another displayed equally convincing lines, the mirror turned against its own face. This inversion is central to the Jungian drama. The persona, the social mask, frays, and the shadow appears. What do we do when we discover the mask isn't enough? A question that wounds as much in war as outside it. In Cologne and the Rhineland, on the bridges of the Ruhr, this question throbbed as the ground vibrated under foreign treads. The mental impact isn't a technical mystery, it's the collapse of a narrative. Psychology and alchemy offers another key. After putrefaction comes the beginning of clarification, the albedo. In human terms, this can be as humble as recognizing exhaustion, as simple as accepting a retreat order without theatrical shame, as difficult as admitting the enemy also fears. Some late accounts speak of this shift. The first encounter with the new tank is terror, the second a more sober reading of the terrain, the third an ethical calculation about lives that could still be saved. Maturity, when it emerges, has a bitter taste. There's no glory, only responsibility. The Pershing as a symbol taught its adversary something, that the myth of the invincible is always provisional, and that perhaps courage, in the end, is less the heroic cry and more the silent decision to care for what remains of humanity. There are gaps technique doesn't fill. The cannon penetrates but doesn't account for the weight of lost friends. The hull's pressure passes but doesn't undo a nightmare. Yet numbers tell stories when used with humility. In those months, urban operations multiplied traps and reduced margins for improvisation. A street corner decided lives, a single shot pierced 4 walls. In this scenario, the perception that the adversary brought a cannon capable of killing at a comfortable distance, that is, without entering the ideal range of Panzerfausts scattered in the rubble, decisively affected morale. The soldier who once banked on proximity as an equalizer now saw distance as a death sentence. It was an intimate adjustment in the compass of hope. The preferred tactic shortened, the body anticipated surrender. If you've made it this far, leave a sign, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos, and comment on what this scene awakens in you. Fear, anger, compassion, doubt? Your perspective helps us delve deeper without sensationalism. And finally, there's the question of perspective. The image that endured, the shot tearing across the street, the burning panther, the Pershing backing up a few yards as if taking a breath, circulated like a parable. Jung would say that myths are born from limit situations dramatized in powerful images. This one had all the ingredients: concise tragedy, absolute contrast, a visible before and after in seconds. What did this parable teach those who saw it from the German side? That the war no longer sustained itself on fantasy. That behind every order a tired human resided. That perhaps the only victory possible there was to protect the remnant of oneself not corroded by soulless discipline or unchecked hatred. That's no small thing. It's the beginning of the return. When the Pershing's engine receded, the echo lingered longer than the smoke. This echo was psychological. It resonated in the following nights, in dreams where narrow corridors were traversed by tank treads, in shelters where breaths synchronized to trick fear. But every echo, if listened to carefully, can reveal something beyond panic. Sometimes, in the interval between one vibration and another, a thread of silence appears. It's there that the albedo begins, the minimal gleam upon the mud. The mental impact of the Pershing on German troops in that first appearance wasn't just a technical shock. It was a brutal invitation to truth. The war ends, myths do too. What remained were men, some still very young, trying to reclaim their own faces from within a crumbled mask. In the days that followed that first appearance, the chronological unfolding brought a kind of fear that wasn't explosive, but sedimentary, accumulating corner after corner, ruin after ruin, until it became a silent crust over the unit's mood. American columns, now with some new silhouettes mixed among Shermans and half-tracks, advanced through villages where time seemed to have stopped. And German troops learned to recognize the sound in their gut before recognizing it with their ears. The fear of a single tank doesn't explain the surrender of a front, but it helps understand the fatigue that moves a hand to drop a weapon a little sooner than the month before. When a rumor said there's a 90mm on the road, the platoon's psychology shifted. Their minds made calculations not considered when ricochets were assumed to be the norm. It's at this point that the symbol ceases to be an anecdote and becomes an internal grammar, the grammar of the end. Chronology is relentless. After the penetrations launched into the Rhineland, lines retreated and the density of urban combat increased, multiplying ambush opportunities while simultaneously amplifying the sense of vulnerability for defenders. The narrow street, once a guaranteed approach for the Panzerfaust, was now also a stage where a 90mm shot capable of piercing walls signaled a new technical balance. What emerged was a dance of adaptive tactics. German garrisons attempting to draw the enemy into close-quarter zones, craters transformed into foxholes, L-shaped positions to await the enemy's flank, while on the American side, additional cautions arose. Infantry clearing paths with machine guns, smoke to blind intersections, the care not to unnecessarily point the turret, where a Panzerfaust might bloom like a pocket flame. Amidst this dance, the few Pershings present functioned as catalysts. They didn't appear on every corner, but the collective unconscious of the defenders began to see them in the rumor of any deeper engine roar. The chronological development also revealed the erosion of beliefs. Months earlier, confidence rested in the Panther's sloped armor, the Tiger's frontal thickness, in manuals that taught where a Sherman should be targeted to silence it. The sudden realization that certainties no longer held true, or held less true, acted like the acid of Jung's nigredo. It putrefied old forms to release material needing reintegration. However, integration takes time, and war doesn't grant that luxury. Hence emerged survival stories that carried no theatrical heroism, but measured choices. A garrison commander cornered in an alley opted to move his still operational vehicle to a secondary position, foregoing the dubious opportunity of a direct duel. An infantry section decided to abandon the basement that once seemed safe because the new cannon split concrete like it was wood. These seemingly small decisions described the transformation of the psychic field. The enemy was no longer just an object to be destroyed, but also the materialization of a destiny that needed to be circumvented to save lives. Jung spoke of the shadow as everything the ego doesn't recognize in itself. As the weeks progressed, the collective shadow of a Germany armed with myths showed its face. Pride wounded by the loss of technical dominance. Poorly digested guilt over excesses, resentment against orders increasingly disconnected from the ground, and the primal fear of dying without purpose. The Pershing provided an effective mirror because it condensed within itself the opposite of what the dominant narrative had sustained for years. This antiodromia, the turn to the opposite, so central to Jungian psychology, took concrete form. The figure of the invincible tank switched sides, and with it, the axis around which morale revolved. In some units, this shift manifested as apathy, in others as an unexpected, almost clinical coolness that sought to regain judgment capacity, far from fantasies. In all, however, psychic energy was migrating, leaving the heroic persona and attempting, confusedly, to find a more human place to land. On a technical level, little was added to what reports already documented. About 24 American heavy tanks arrived late and in modest numbers, but with a cannon that offered confidence against targets that previously demanded risky approaches. What these reports didn't quantify, and personal diaries often captured, was how a single encounter altered subsequent decision chains. A platoon that saw its cover implode 200 yards away began in the following days to hear far-off noises that perhaps didn't exist. A sergeant who lost 2 men in an alley independently cut the radius of stay in exposed areas. A radio transmitted the word heavy with a more urgent timbre, even without confirmation. In Man and His Symbols, Jung describes how charged images invade consciousness and command behavior without passing through the intellect's filter. The image of the 90mm spitting fire on a narrow street transformed, the next day, into a tacit rule of conduct. Avoid the line of fire, change position, don't trust the wall's thickness. Life was preserved this way, but the cost was a piece of the soul that shrank. There are also stories of resilience that don't fit the stereotype of total collapse. In some blocks where the rumor of the heavy echoed, garrisons improvised old-school stratagems, tricking the turret with reflections, using the smoke of their own destruction to mask a withdrawal, synchronizing the shot of a weary anti-tank gun with the calculated emergence of a vulnerable flank. When such gestures worked, the psyche gained a relief Jung would call the beginning of albedo, a modest clarification after the night. It's the moment when the symbol ceases to be just an ogre and becomes an object with concrete limitations. The Pershing might be imposing, but it isn't omnipresent. Its hull is thick, yet not invulnerable. Its logistics are demanding, and narrow streets, dubious bridges, determined sappers still tell stories. The recognition of these realities doesn't undo the trauma, but restores to the soldier a shred of agency, a piece of a world where choices make a difference. The advance inland delivered another psychological layer, the perception of inevitable arrival. As strategic points fell, the idea that they will come acquired the cruel tranquility of non-negotiable truths. This changed conversations in the shelters. While propaganda insisted, men's mouths preferred the underground of confidences. If the new one comes, we don't stay at the window, we go down to the passage. Don't wait for the second attempt, move to another house. Listen to the ground, not the street. Practical wisdom is a form of individuation in an emergency regime. The subject renounces the inflated persona and seeks a posture adjusted to reality. In psychology and alchemy, this passage, when not interrupted by rigid defense or despair, allows new contents to organize themselves. In the field, this translated into discipline without theatricality, into courage that avoided display, into an almost tender focus on the small things: water, blankets, a return route. Paradoxically, it's when the symbol reaches its maximum strength that it can also push consciousness to a more sober place. On the American side, the same symbol operated in reverse. It boosted morale, injected the feeling that now we've got this. This mattered because morale is a closed circuit. When one side felt it had gained a chess piece, the other, by mirroring, experienced the loss of a piece that perhaps never numerically belonged to them, but belonged to them narratively. This adversarial strengthening also weighed on the defender's mind. To know that on the other side were men who, for months, had feared the thickness of their panther and now smiled at the sight of their own cannon's thick nose, was to experience the inversion of the myth in real time. It's hard to fight an adversary whose psyche has been fed fresh hope. The scene repeated. The tread bit into the gravel, the noise multiplied against the walls. The turret moved slowly, framing windows where eyes might be. The one behind the crosshairs didn't see the other's soul, but the soul of the one listening to the engine felt it. Survival stories from this period had a sober metric: don't die today. There are accounts of units that, at the first rumor of the heavy tank, reorganized their observer network to maximize warning and minimize panic. There are examples of junior leaders who, sensing the state of their men, swapped tasks to spare those with their ears full. All of this indicated a psychic movement of the ego tending to its limits. Jung would say that individuation isn't grandiloquent. Often it's the acceptance of one's own measure. The soldier who admitted to trembling and swapped posts didn't flee. He cared for himself so the whole wouldn't collapse. It's the opposite of the inflated persona that, for fear of appearing weak, insisted on remaining until it broke. In a context where the enemy's symbol is suffocating, such honesty is an act of strength. The evolution of perceptions over the weeks showed, however, how the shadow resists. Even when the mind understood the Pershing was rare, the body wasn't easily convinced. The conditioning from the first encounter, the flash, the roar, the split wall, installed in the nervous system a readiness that didn't distinguish between an M26 and a truck with a loud exhaust. This hypervigilance, if unrecognized, turned into sabotage. It exhausted attention, accelerated triggers, multiplied false alarms. German troops, with less rest, fewer supplies, and less cohesion, suffered doubly. Care for this dynamic appeared in small rituals, rotating not just positions, but ears. Scrambling routes to prevent a single noise from becoming destiny. Barking low instructions before crossing a street overlooking a likely axis. The command that knew how to protect its men from the symbol's tyranny prolonged the unit's lifespan. The command that ignored the invisible pressure saw its cohesion dissolve like ice in warm water. Amidst this fabric, individual voices sometimes erupted with piercing lucidity. A messenger noted that the heavy thing they bring makes walls porous, and added, almost as a lament, "It's not just the wall." A gunner noted that we keep listening before we see, and in that listening, we lose the little courage we had left to peak. A sergeant, training young recruits, wrote that it's strange when their new one appears, some become calmer, as if there was nothing left to decide. Just do the best possible. These phrases could be from an analytical psychology seminar. The first names the symbol's invasion, the second the capture of attention by the numinous image, the third the productive surrender that sometimes arises when the myth of control falls. The collective unconscious, saturated, tried to find a decent way to conclude the experience. If you're following the reasoning so far, make it count. Comment where you're from and if you've ever felt, in another area of life, an engine arriving from outside that seems to dictate everything. And if this content helps you think more calmly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this investigation. Closing this initial chronological block, it's worth noting the less obvious lesson. A war symbol doesn't destroy alone, but reorganizes the field where destructions and preservations are decided. The M26 Pershing, arriving late and in small numbers, didn't win the war, but for many German defenders, it became a visual and auditory password that the axis had shifted, that the distance that once protected now wounded, that the home where impact was awaited was no longer a home. Jung didn't write about tanks. He wrote about images that govern conduct. And that's what we see, a heavy, numinous image operating like a magnet that aligns, in pain and pragmatism, the filings of the psyche. When the iron of imagination is oriented, the compass of action follows. The rest, what is done with this orientation, belongs to each individual's ethical field. Surrender, retreat, resist only to save civilians, or, at times, insist on the duel that doesn't need to happen. War, which often masquerades as mathematics, is also this, a continuous negotiation between symbols we awaken to at dawn and pieces of humanity we try to keep awake until morning. The turning point didn't come with an explosion, but with a silence that weighed heavier than any blast. After hours of sparse gunfire, the deep engine idled across the square, and suspended dust began to fall like dirty snow. The turret moved slowly, unhurriedly, as if saying, "Time is mine now." There, in the middle of an afternoon that seemed to darken prematurely, the internal story of a platoon crumbled. The climax wasn't the destruction of a vehicle. It was the unspoken, shared discovery that the narrative holding them up, that technique and courage would suffice, had changed hands. Jung would call this enantiodromia, the passage to the opposite. When a principle, taken to its extreme, summons its own negation, the invincible transferred from one symbol to another, and with it, the emotion-sustaining resistance reorganized. The Pershing, rare on the map, became omnipresent in the imagination. It's at this paradoxical instant that numbers emerge which, alone, explain nothing, and together say a great deal. The first 24 of these tanks arrived late, and though dozens more appeared in the following weeks, they represented a fraction of the total Allied force in the sector. Even so, reports noted increases in surrenders in urban areas soon after the first filmed appearances. Exhausted detachments reported abandoning positions before the second shot when a 90mm was suspected on the street. Companies registered rapid drops in morale when rumors circulated that the heavy was in the neighborhood. These aren't cold percentages, but human statistics. Those already at their limit needed a trigger to admit it. The new tank offered that trigger, materializing an intimate truth no one dared to utter. Utilitarian heroism was over, preservation remained. The sharp irony is that an impersonal symbol of force opens space for personal gestures of mercy. In a house with no facade, a sergeant who had trained young men in the use of the Panzerfaust made a decision he would have considered cowardly months earlier, not to wait for the perfect angle for an ambush. He told the young men to go down with their families to the back basement, indicated the window opposite the noise, and, in an interval between the turret's rotation and the engine's echo, crossed the corridor carrying a child who wasn't his. The scene, remembered years later as if a dream, had a precise sensory texture. The grit of soot on his fingers, the sweet, cloying smell of burnt wood, the persistent ringing in his ears that refused to shut off. The monstrous tank, archetype of the urban dragon, functioned there as a psychopomp, the figure who, in myths, guides passage. It guided that man from a bellicose persona to a simpler identity, that of one who prioritizes lives even under the relentless gaze of steel. Climax is also what redefines fear. On another street, a garrison maintained the technical coolness the circumstance still allowed. They kept silent, measured the time between turret rotations, read the engine's cadence like one reads an animal's breath, and when the tread bit into a sidewalk step, momentarily exposing its flank, the old, poorly maintained cannon fired. It didn't penetrate, but the hit deflected the hull a few degrees, enough for the American column to abort the crossing and detour via another route. To survive, there was a minimal statistic: 6 men who breathed. The psychological impact, however, was a planet knocked out of orbit. Jung would say that the numinous image doesn't vanish at the first failure, it redraws itself. For those 6, the blind god lost its omnipotence and gained contour. It didn't become a toy, but it ceased to be absolute destiny. This micro-victory was an albedo in the midst of the Black City, a clarification that didn't boast, merely kept a flicker alight. At the height of discomfort, certain truths became palpable. The first, the body learns faster than the mind. Even knowing the Pershing was rare, the nerves heard one on every corner. Hence, instances of hypervigilance multiplied false alarms, and the sound of a worn-out truck was enough to disperse positions and waste ammunition. The second, proximity, once an urban defender's ally, became a high-risk market. Panzerfausts remained lethal at a few yards, but the need to get close now cost courage that the exhausted body negotiated sparingly. The third, the adversary's morale mattered. On the other side, the presence of a 90mm fed discreet smiles, quick comments like, "Now we're in," and an operational calm that traveled via radio and word of mouth. Morale is as contagious as fear. When one side encounters dismay in the other, the mental geography of a block shifts. At the deepest level, however, the climax is psychic. The shadow ceases to be merely everything I'm not, and comes to include one's own recent history. The combatant who believed himself the center of the technical myth suddenly needed to embrace within himself the image of one who lacked parts, fuel, food, meaning. This embrace is painful because it undoes the narrative of control. In psychology and alchemy, negredo isn't just darkness, it's the decomposition of rigid forms. What forms dissolve there? Technical pride, the fantasy of "we'll always find a way," the belief that courage alone is enough. At the climax, the enemy of steel, paradoxically, offered a mirror to behold one's own fatigue. When this vision doesn't collapse the subject, a mutation occurs. The energy invested in denying reality is freed to care for what exists: water, retreat routes, protection of civilians, preservation of the wounded. It's a small, concrete ethic, very different from rhetoric, and precisely for that reason, transformative. The statistic that hurts most doesn't appear in tables. It's the tally of fragmented dreams. Nightmares of corridors where treads scraped stone. Dreams where the 90mm barrel moved like a clock hand on a dial without numbers. Images of walls breathing with the engine's vibration. Jung would remind us that when a symbol dominates waking life, it will invade the night until integrated. To integrate here isn't to like the symbol, it's to recognize its effect and make choices based on that recognition. A corporal who couldn't bear the sound swapped listening duty and, in the interim, learned to repair boots. A gunner who trembled at the trigger's touch became an observer and saved more than he would have killed. A messenger, terrified of open streets, became a guide for improvised tunnels. The shadow, when accepted as a part, restores vocations that war doesn't usually value, and which, nonetheless, sustain the minimum of humanity. There's a historical irony that closes this arc. The same eyes that, years earlier, were trained to admire the robust lines of their own armored vehicles, now recognized functional beauty in the enemy. Some described the calm of the new turret, the serenity of its retreat after firing, the way it advanced without spasm. It wasn't aesthetic capitulation, it was the confession that the psyche seeks order even in chaos. And when it finds order on the other side, it's harder to maintain the conviction that one is fighting for a superior form of world. This wound to belief, coupled with exhaustion, explains why, in certain sectors, the surrender rate rose after a single demonstration. A filmed duel crossed borders with a speed bulletins couldn't match. The image became a street catechism, taught by word of mouth. If you hear the heavy one, move early, don't wait for the second shot. The climax also wrung confessions from leaders. A lieutenant who had until then insisted on pinning down the enemy to gain time wrote that once the heavy tank's presence was identified, shifting to delaying tactics without direct contact saved lives that would otherwise have become statistics. He recorded, without remorse, having chosen less prominent streets to open passage for families who couldn't have gotten out amidst the gunfire on the main axes. The climax also wrung confessions from leaders. A lieutenant who had until then insisted on pinning down the enemy to gain time wrote that once the heavy tank's presence was identified, shifting to delaying tactics without direct contact saved lives that would otherwise have become statistics. He recorded, without remorse, having chosen less prominent streets to open passage for families who couldn't have gotten out amidst the gunfire on the main axes. It's there that Jungian analysis meets ethics. To individuate in war is to accept that the self, that totality encompassing shadow and light, demands choices that honor life where it insists on existing. The persona of the inflexible officer dissolved, giving way to a responsible subject. There was no applause, only a sigh, and a conscience light enough to sleep for a few hours, despite the engines. In sensory terms, this center of transformation had taste and texture. Dust clinging to the tongue, cold sweat on the palms, a tremor rising from the knees when the ground's vibration announced proximity. The eye learned to read light filtered by smoke as if it were language. The ear, saturated, tried to discover silence between noises. On the best of days, there was a second of unjust beauty. A fine rain falling on hot bricks, a bird crossing the street at the exact instant the turret paused, that reminded the body it was born for something other than this. These memories, however small, functioned as antidotes against depersonalization. Jung would speak of signs of the self emerging through cracks, reminding the ego that there was still life to be protected beyond the role played in the historical machine. If this content helps you think more deeply and calmly about symbols that govern behavior in times of crisis, leave a comment telling us where you're from and share it with someone who appreciates historical analyses with a psychological lens. And, of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. Because, in the end, the climax isn't the victory of one weapon over another. It's the silent turning point where men, forced to choose between myth and reality, choose what can still be saved. The Pershing will remain a dense image, urban dragon, impersonal judge, mirror of fatigue. But the story that matters, amidst the fire and rebel, is of those who, facing the shadow, found a courage without spectacle. That of admitting limits, changing tactics, protecting strangers. This courage rarely graces posters, but it sustains invisible bridges between what we were during the night and what we become again when day finally arrives. As the front folded eastward and improvised bridges multiplied over heavily named rivers, the advance gained a cadence that blended weariness and method. The final phase lacked the theatricality of the initial breakthroughs, but rather a sequence of cold pushes, swept streets, brief interrogations, and maps with arrows that no longer promised glory, only conclusion. In this context, the new heavy tank operated as a piece of morale and psychological engineering. It wasn't everywhere, but where it appeared, it rewrote the tone. In sensitive crossings, the Pershing stood sentinel on the bank, its turret dominating long diagonals. And on the other side, defenders who had learned to recognize the engine's timber opted to retreat before the street became a sieve. It wasn't that a single vehicle changed logistical curves. It was that it catalyzed human decisions which, accumulated, shortened battles. There was an instance in a mid-sized town where the heavy tank took position at the corner of an open block. American infantry, who had already learned to distrust windows with intact curtains, moved across cautiously, while the 90mm barrel maintained the tense silence of one who only speaks when necessary. On the German side, a heterogeneous group, weary veterans, a very young man, two hastily recruited middle-aged men, lived the compressed debate between pride and prudence. The oldest, who knew the thickness of his own street's walls, said the new one would cut through them like a knife through butter. There was no fuel for a counterattack, nor ammunition left for a token duel. They retreated to the back street, opened passage for families, and that morning no one died there. The Pershing didn't fire, its mere presence was enough. In Man and His Symbols, Jung reminds us that the symbol's efficacy lies in its ability to organize experience. There, it organized the experience of both sides. One saved lives because it saw, the other because it was seen. As the war entered its final bend, accounts took on a tone of moral inventory. Officers who for months had demanded retention at all costs now wrote orders with more modest verbs: delay, divert, preserve. The intermittent presence of the heavy tank wasn't the foundation of this change, but it was the mirror that helped accept it. In psychology and alchemy, the passage from nigredo to an initial clarification implies recognizing what has died and what can still live. In this sense, the new tank, with its numinous mass, acted as a strange priest celebrating the liturgy of conclusion. Its metallic shadow, projected on facades, spoke what speeches could no longer convince. It was thus that, in some sectors, white flags appeared before the second shot, and entire columns preferred capture to another turn of the turret. On the American side, the transformation was also internal. Crews who had endured months with less secure platforms felt, with the 90mm, something akin to relief. Relief in war is dangerous when it flares. There, however, it came tempered by the setting. Ruins, civilians, traps, the Panzerfaust always lurking. The heavy tank offered distance and penetration, but didn't nullify the sins of complacency. It's in this balance, recent confidence, learned caution, that Jungian enantiodromia is wisely perceived at work, a tendency that, if overemphasized, calls forth its opposite. Overcoming fear with excessive courage invites imprudence. The symbol, when recognized, demands conscious humility. The Pershing's own silence between one shot and another reminded them that war is a business of waiting, and that the myth of the invincible is always a temporary mask. Its influence on the course of events, when viewed on a larger scale, had the modesty of decisive things. It wasn't the heavy tank alone that broke open the final pockets, but it was part of a chorus of signals that played the same refrain. The technical and moral axis had shifted. The frayed German lines had less fuel than ideas, less ammunition than memories, and the appearances of an enemy with the power to penetrate at a safe distance eroded the last gamble in the street corners. It's easy to overestimate and easy to underestimate this effect. Justice lies in the middle. Where the heavy tank operated, it shortened duels, spared crossings, and broke the spell of resistance in blocks where the myth still kept men on their feet. Where it wasn't, the rumor of its possible presence was enough for routes to be redesigned and blood, at times, avoided. Stories coming from field hospitals brought another texture. A medic wrote that, in the final weeks, wounds had distinct profiles in cities where the new one was rumored to be. Fewer proximity shrapnel wounds, more clean impacts from long diagonals. This changed the work. Fewer hurried amputations in the corridor, more planned surgeries in the main tent. For caregivers, this difference was biographical. I felt that, for a handful of days, we had the rare luxury of choosing for whom our attention could mean more time, he noted. The phrase is stark because it recognizes an arithmetic that ethics abhors, but reality imposes. If the heavy tank's presence increased the distance of engagements und reduzierte die Frequenz von Suizidal-Duellen in tight corners, dann its ultimate impact included lives saved in Weisen offiziell Accounting nie enumerierte. In deutschen Soldatendiaries der Ton shiftete von Severität zu einem allneust pastoraler Sinceriet. They spoke of small things, shoes das finally dried, ein shared loaf of bread, eine Nacht, wenn nur Genuna dreamte von engines. It's at this level dass Individuation, even late, make sense. Jung würde sagen, dass das Selbst calls die Ego zu einer broader center, capable of containing contradiction, duty und care, shame und courage, defeat und dignity. Der Enemy of Steel, which at first war ein Drache, now figurt als eine Mediator des Crossing. Bei Akzeptieren es Presence als eine Sentence of ein Ending, many could, paradoxalerweise, restart the count of the human. Protecting children, negotiating a surrender, ohne unnötige Humiliation, embracing a comrade without fear of appearing weak. The symbol, once traversed, ceased to command, it began to teach. Dessen Episode, wo ein amerikanischer Column, guided bei einer Provisionsbridge das trempelte unter each tread, advanced with the heavy tank in front, like a slow drummer. Auf der anderen Seite Defenses waren das empty als derer Braut, und der German Commanders Decision war zu erwarten ein Signal, das nie kam. Es nie kam, weil an einem certain Punkt History had already decided for him. Das Turret rotierte, sweepte das Street, sah no targets. Infanterie fanned out und das Sound von Boots ersetzte der Engines-Mantra. Der Commander, who awaited der Window of Honor, unterstand, dass Honor da war different, nicht zu feiern. Later he noted in restrained handwriting, dass samtmals sperren die City ist eine Weise von remaining in it. Der Phrase, which könnte inhabiten ein Chapter von Aion, wo Jung explores der Chateau und das Selbst, points to the psychology of legacy. Zu remain nicht als einer, wer dominiert, als einer, wer kehrt für was remains. Dies Avance in die Final-Phasen auch illuminierte andere Schatten. Those who insisted on unnecessary battles oft deden so aus Fair von The Void, der wird kommen afterward. Der militärische Persona, ohne War, führte Evaporation. Der Heavy Tank als Symbol des End war auch ein Symbol von einem unsicheren Future. Integrieren diese Angstbereitschaft requierte für Sam eine Courage auf einer anderen Order. Imaginieren ein Life ohne die literale und psychologische Armor. There were those who looked at the ruins and already saw workshops, schools, markets. There were those who merely trembled before the silent question. The conjunctio, union of opposites, which Jung describes as the work's goal, here took the humble form of reconciling survival and repair, memory and future, guilt and restitution. The impersonal steel, which seemed to embody closure, opened a rift through which entered the most difficult task, rehumanization. If you feel this kind of reading helps you look at history with more hope and less cynicism, leave a comment and share it with someone who enjoys psychological analyses applied to war. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the final chapter of this series. Your participation strengthens this work. From a historical standpoint, the heavy tank's presence announced a lesson that would span decades. After the war, entire doctrines were reconfigured and the platform itself evolved. But what's interesting here is the invisible legacy, the awareness that images govern battles as much as orders. In the final phase, the new tank was a condensed image of destiny and also of possibility. For the attackers, it synthesized disciplined operational confidence. For the defenders, it offered the missing mirror to admit their limit. Neither of these forces is tangible on a map, but both shift the arrows. As we close this segment, it's worth remembering that morale isn't just the sum of good news. It's the narrative a collective tells itself. The Pershing, arriving late, became a stern editor of that narrative. It cut scenes of bravado, removed close-ups of duels that no longer needed to happen, and favored wider shots. Streets emptied in time, surrenders made with decency, crossings that didn't turn into carnage. In Jung's language, the symbol fulfilled its function when it ceased to be God and became word, something that names and guides without trapping. The rest, judgment, reconstruction, memory, belongs to the final part of this story, where we'll see how this encounter between steel and soul shaped a psychological legacy that endures beyond the battlefields and continues to ask us, like a slowly turning turret, what do you choose to save when the world demands haste? The conclusion didn't come with trumpets, but as an honest exhaustion. A city deciding to breathe, men stopping their impossible promises, engines falling silent without fanfare. In the final inventory, what remained wasn't the elongated shadow of the 90mm barrel on the facades, but the silent curve of choices that aligned around a simple idea: preserve what remains of humanity. The Pershing, as a late and impactful presence, was less the author and more the editor of that chapter. It adjusted pauses, shortened scenes of bravado, opened space for a kind of courage that doesn't demand applause. And if we want to talk about numbers without losing the soul, then let's put it this way. At first, only a few dozen arrived, enough to inaugurate a grammar. In the final weeks, a few hundred crossed the Atlantic, enough to become a firm comma in the Western Front's closing sentences. Little if the yardstick is absolute quantity, decisive if the scale is that of the symbol which reorganizes conduct. Total statistics hide and at the same time reveal this dual nature. In material terms, the 90mm brought a margin against armor that previously demanded risky approximation. In human terms, that margin became a sigh. We can do this without pushing everyone to the corner where they die. On the German side, the reverse of this margin was a bitter acceptance. We don't need to stay until we turn to dust. Thus, effects accumulate that don't fit into spreadsheets. Crossings spared from useless gunfire, surrenders that occurred before the second shot, routes redesigned to avoid deadly diagonals. If the question is what, in the end, this tank added to the course of events, the answer must contain two verbs. It concentrated and it conserved. It concentrated expectations, fears, and hopes into an image that made sense to exhausted men. It conserved lives because it restored scale to judgment, reducing the space for purposeless duels. In the industrial sphere, the legacy is clear and impersonal. The M26's lines inaugurated a path that would set a precedent. Sufficient power to face heavy armor, ergonomics and stabilization that would teach generations of designers, and a doctrinal vision that from the post-war era onward pointed towards combat vehicles capable of balancing fire, protection, and mobility as an indivisible triangle. The family derived from it, with updates and renamings that time consecrated, confirmed that engineering learns quickly when war imposes harsh tests. But however much industry celebrates steel and geometry, I keep returning to faces, to the medic who noted fewer contact explosions and more clean impacts when distance became possible, to the sergeant who walked an entire block to, in his own words, learn to listen to the ground and not the myth. On the psychological plane, the legacy travels farther than the hulls. The symbolic operation the Pershing performed, That of condensing the end, of forcing a revision of persona, remains valid whenever a collective imbues an image with the power to accelerate truth. For the attacker, the symbol helped tame euphoria and replace bravado with method. For the defender, it helped traverse the negredo toward a beginning of albedo, where admitting limits became an act of responsibility. Jung didn't write doctrines of armored vehicles. He wrote about traversing the shadow and forming a broader center capable of containing opposites. What transpired in those streets, the recognition that courage can also be retreat, that dignity can also be surrendering to save civilians, that the enemy also fears, is an applied lesson in individuation under fire. And when that lesson is learned, war loses ground within people before it loses on the map. Some ask for precise numbers, and I respect that. So here's the possible portrait without betrayal. An initial program that landed a few dozen for a debut on the front, an escalation to a few hundred before the European ceasefire, a small fraction in the Allied armored universe, and a moral effect that spread faster than columns of steel ever could. There's no precise statistic for the fear that decides to abandon an ally, nor for the serenity that prefers to negotiate. There is, however, consensus in accounts that the combination of canon, late presence, and shared narrative gave the adversary the sense of "your time is up," and to the crews who operated it, the sense of "now we can push through without grinding everyone down." On the other side of the noise, as cities began to relearn their names, the slow work Jung would call conjunctio on a civil scale began, reconciling memory and future. Workshops reappeared where depots had burned. Schools etched themselves onto still-stained floors. Markets returned to the street the sound that doesn't kill. Those who returned with nightmares, insistent engines, barrels turning alone in the mind, discovered that the symbol isn't silenced by denial, but by witness, care, and time. Some wrote, others taught, many simply worked with disciplined hands, as if hammering wood were an alchemical therapy to reorganize matter and soul. In this reconstruction, the Pershing shrinks as life grows. It's natural. Symbols of war are grand in the hour of the wound. In healing, they yield to symbols of craft, a set table, protected childhood. We arrive then at the final sentence, not as a hammer, but as a seed. If, upon hearing an engine that isn't yours, you feel that life wants to dictate the rhythm through fear, remember that the most powerful image isn't the one that threatens, but the one that guides. He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens, Jung said in one of his most oft-repeated insights. The awakening that mattered in those streets wasn't to heroism, but to responsibility. And that's the point that spans decades. Technology changes the curvature of events, but it's psychic maturity that decides what we do with the chance to spare suffering. When a symbol of steel forced men to admit the end, it also opened the possibility of a more conscious beginning. If this series helped you see history with more depth and less noise, tell me in the comments where you're from and what resonated with you. Subscribe to the channel to follow future investigations and share this video with someone who needs to hear about courage without spectacle. In the end, between the weight of iron and the weight of conscience, choose the latter. It's what remains when the smoke clears.